Ah, the French Revolution. That romantic period of history when people gathered in the squares to discuss philosophy, sing the Marseillaise, and behead anyone who took a suspicious breath. If you think living in 2025 is complicated, imagine having to survive between 1789 and 1799 without ending up with your head separated from your body for some utterly ridiculous reason. You probably think you'd be different, that you'd certainly be on the right side of history, heroically marching the oppressed people toward liberty. But the inconvenient truth is that statistically speaking, you'd have a much greater chance of becoming yet another victim of the guillotine than a revolutionary hero. And why is that? Well, prepare yourself for a dose of historical reality seasoned with a dash of irony. You wear clothes that are too clean. Yes, your personal hygiene would be your death sentence, while you pride yourself on bathing daily and wearing washed clothes. In revolutionary France, this would be a clear sign that you belonged to the decadent aristocracy. The authentic people had a characteristic smell of sweat, mud, and revolution. If you showed up on the street smelling of soap and with clean fingernails, you could kiss your head goodbye. The sans culottes, literally without breeches, because wearing knee breeches was a bourgeois thing, developed an infallible radar for detecting any trace of personal refinement. Did you wear perfume? Aristocrat. Did you have all your ball? Teeth? Suspicious. Did your clothes not have at least 3 visible patches? Definitely an enemy of the people. The irony is that many genuinely poor revolutionaries ended up being executed simply for having taken a bath before leaving the house. Imagine explaining to the Revolutionary Tribunal that you just wanted to be presentable to support the people's cause. Citizen, the fact that you do not stink like a dead horse clearly proves you are an agent of the counter-revolution. You know how to gag, read, and that's a problem. Paradoxically, in a revolution that advocated for education for all, being literate could be extremely dangerous. Not because literacy itself was criminal, but because you'd inevitably demonstrate that knowledge at the most inconvenient time. Imagine this. You're waiting in line for bread, and someone holds up a revolutionary pamphlet. Automatically, you read it aloud. Congratulations. You've just marked yourself as someone with a formal education, something 90% of the population lacked. And where did formal education come from? The church or families with resources? Both coincidentally, mortal enemies of the people. It would be even worse if you demonstrated knowledge of Latin, mathematics, or, God forbid, philosophy. Quoting Voltaire might sound revolutionary, but it would actually label you as someone who had access to expensive books and free time to study, luxuries incompatible with the life of a true worker of the people. The situation became even more absurd when you consider that many of the revolutionary leaders were highly educated intellectuals, but somehow they managed to be intellectuals of the people, while you would just be a suspicious intellectual. The difference? Mostly luck and political timing. You can't fake revolutionary enthusiasm. 24/7, let's be honest for a moment. Could you genuinely shout, "Death to the enemies of the Republic," with real conviction at 6 a.m. on a Monday? Because in revolutionary France, demonstrating anything less than total ecstasy for the revolution at any hour of the day or night was practically a confession of treason. Revolutionary enthusiasm wasn't something you could turn on and off at your convenience. You were expected to wake up singing patriotic hymns, work with a smile of dedication to the fatherland, and go to sleep muttering oaths of loyalty to the Republic. Any moment of fatigue, irritation, or simple, normal humanity would be interpreted as evidence of counter-revolutionary feelings. Imagine trying to explain to a tribunal that you just had a headache when you failed to shout, "Long live Robespierre," with the proper vigor during a demonstration. Citizen, Your migraine is clearly a symptom of monarchical nostalgia, to the guillotine. The cruelest part is that this unsustainable level of emotional performance ended up exhausting even sincere revolutionaries. Many were executed simply for showing fatigue from the constant political theater, perfectly understandable, but politically fatal: weariness. You have opinions about food. In pre-revolutionary France, having an opinion about food was natural. After all, French cuisine was already recognized worldwide. But during the Revolution, expressing any food preference that went beyond black bread and water was an act of class betrayal. Complaining that the bread was moldy? Spoiled aristocrat. Suggesting that a little butter might improve the meal? Enemy of the people who doesn't understand the sacrifice necessary for the cause. Mentioning that you've eaten meat more than once in your life? Clearly an exploiter of the working masses. The absurdity reached the point where people were denounced for dreaming about food out loud. Yes, that's right. Sleep-talking about a nice stew could be interpreted as evidence that you were mentally living like an aristocrat, even if your last feast had been a boiled potato 3 days ago. The final irony? Many of the revolutionary leaders continued to eat relatively well, but somehow managed to maintain the narrative that they were simple men of the people, while executing citizens for expressing a longing for a piece of cheese. You can't memorize all the names of the revolution's martyrs. The French Revolution produced martyrs faster than you could memorize their names, and not being able to recite the complete list was a grave offense to the memory of the people's heroes. The problem is that this list changed constantly, because yesterday's hero often became today's traitor. Imagine the pressure. You finally memorize the names of all known martyrs by Tuesday. But on Wednesday, 3 new ones were added to the list, and 2 were removed for having been discovered as traitors. Confusing the chronological order of the heroic deaths, or even worse, mentioning someone who had been posthumously cancelled, could be interpreted as a deliberate act of sabotage. The cruelest part was when you tried to honor someone you genuinely thought was still considered a hero, only to find out they had been reclassified as an enemy of the people the previous week. Citizen, your devotion to the traitor X clearly proves you are involved in the same conspiracy. It was like trying to play a video game where the rules changed every 5 minutes, except losing meant actual death, not just having to restart the level. You use words with more than 3 syllables. Vocabulary became a minefield during the Revolution. Using sophisticated words was immediate proof of an aristocratic education, but using words that were too simple could be interpreted as condescension toward the people. You had to find the perfect balance of authentically popular vocabulary, an impossible task for anyone not born into the working class. Saying perceptive instead of smart could cost you your life. Using magnitude instead of size was practically a confession of treason. And don't you dare mention that something was extraordinary when you could simply say very good, unless you wanted to be accused of linguistic elitism. The issue was that many of these aristocratic words were simply part of the normal vocabulary of any minimally educated person. But in the revolutionary paranoia, any cultural differentiation became suspect. It was as if the revolution was trying to create an egalitarian utopia through the systematic elimination of anyone who knew more than 3 synonyms for beautiful. The ultimate irony? Many of the most famous revolutionary speeches were filled with exactly those aristocratic words. But somehow, coming from the mouths of the correct leaders, they became the language of the people. You demonstrate knowledge of geography. Knowing where other countries were, or worse, having been to them, was extremely suspicious. How could an ordinary person have knowledge of the world beyond France's borders? Obviously, only through aristocratic connections or suspicious commercial activities. casually mentioning that Paris is north of Marseille could raise eyebrows. Knowing that England is an island? Definitely information obtained through contacts with enemies of the revolution. And if you demonstrated knowledge of other countries' customs, that was clear proof you had traveled. And who had money to travel, besides aristocrats and exploitative bourgeoisie? The most absurd thing was that the revolution itself was constantly at war with half of Europe, yet somehow expecting ordinary citizens to know anything about those enemy countries was considered suspect. It was as if the revolution wanted to fight enemies that were simultaneously a mortal threat and completely unknown. Even knowing how to read a map could be problematic. Maps were tools for navigation, and navigation was associated with international trade, a typically bourgeois activity. Better to pretend the world ended at the borders of your hometown. You can't cry on command. The appropriate public emotions were mandatory during revolutionary events. Not crying during the executions of traitors, suspicious, not showing enough joy during patriotic celebrations, counter-revolution, showing any inappropriate emotion at the wrong time, straight to the guillotine. The problem is that genuine emotions are, by definition, difficult to fake convincingly. And even if you managed to produce the right tears at the right moment, there was always the risk that someone would interpret your emotions differently, cried too much during an execution. Maybe you were mourning the death of a fellow conspirator. You had to have not only the correct emotions, but the exact intensity of the correct emotions, demonstrated at the precise time and directed at the appropriate targets. It was like a deadly emotional choreography, where one misstep meant death. The most perverse part was that this constant pressure to perform specific emotions inevitably made all emotions less authentic. But expressing weariness with this emotional theater was, of course, evidence of anti-revolutionary sentiments. You own more than 2 pairs of shoes. Material possessions were a dangerous indicator of class status. Having more shoes than strictly necessary for basic survival was proof of bourgeois excess. But here was the problem. What exactly constituted necessary? 1 pair for work, maybe 1 for Sunday. That might still be defensible. But if you had the audacity to own specific shoes for different activities, say rain boots in addition to your normal shoes, that was clearly evidence of an aristocratic lifestyle. The absurdity intensified when you consider that having only 1 pair of shoes meant that when they wore out, you'd be barefoot. But buying new shoes before the old ones were completely destroyed could be interpreted as bourgeois vanity. And don't think that lower quality shoes would solve the problem. Shoes that were too cheap suggested you were deliberately trying to appear poorer than you actually were, also suspicious. You had to find the exact level of shoe quality that demonstrated proletarian authenticity without suggesting bourgeois disguise. You know what day of the week. It is the French revolutionary calendar was one of the revolution's most confusing innovations. Suddenly, December became Frimaire. Sunday ceased to exist, and weeks had 10 days. Continuing to use the old calendar was an act of counter-revolutionary resistance. But mastering the new system was also suspicious. If you knew the new calendar too well, that suggested you had had the time and resources to study it, luxuries incompatible with the life of a genuine worker. But if you kept using the old calendar, that was obvious proof of nostalgia for the former regime. The ideal situation was to demonstrate appropriate confusion with the new system, while showing enthusiastic willingness to learn. But even that was risky, because demonstrating the wrong amount of confusion could suggest passive resistance. The most ridiculous thing was that many government officials continued to secretly use the old calendar to coordinate with other countries. But woe betide you if you were caught doing the same thing for basic practical reasons. You can't identify all the enemies of the people on sight. Every good citizen was expected to be able to identify counter-revolutionaries, spies, disguised aristocrats, and other enemies of the people simply by looking at them. This seemingly supernatural ability to detect treason through physical characteristics was considered a natural quality of the popular instinct. Failing to recognize a known enemy of the people when they passed on the street was evidence of complicity, or, at best, a lack of proper revolutionary vigilance. But incorrectly identifying someone as an enemy could also be problematic, especially if that person had political connections. The issue was that the criteria for identifying enemies were simultaneously specific and vague. Clothes too nice, suspicious. Posture too straight. Aristocratic education. Hands too clean. Clearly doesn't work for a living. But all these signs could also be found in perfectly innocent people. The paranoia reached the point where people were encouraged to denounce neighbors based on intuitions about their loyalty. It was like a deadly guessing game where the rules were constantly changing and the prize for being wrong was death. You have too much memory, remembering how things were before could be dangerous. Any nostalgic comparison with aspects of pre-revolutionary life, even completely apolitical things like the taste of bread or the frequency of festivals, could be interpreted as a longing for the old regime. But having insufficient memory was also problematic. Not remembering the specific crimes of the old regime when asked could suggest monarchist sympathies. You had to have the exact amount of memory about the correct aspects of the past. The cruelest part was that many people had genuinely mixed memories of the earlier period. Yes, there was oppression and injustice, but there were also aspects of daily life that were objectively better. Expressing that natural nuance of the human experience was politically fatal. It was as if the revolution demanded that everyone develop selective amnesia, remembering only the aspects that supported the official narrative, while completely forgetting any contradictory evidence, a psychological impossibility for normal minds. You exist, perhaps the most ironic reason of all, was simply continuing to exist long enough to become suspicious. The French Revolution developed an internal logic where survival itself became evidence of complicity with counter-revolutionary forces. Think about it. If you were truly innocent, why hadn't you been executed yet? If you were genuinely loyal to the revolution, why hadn't you died heroically in its defense? The continuation of your mundane existence, working, eating, sleeping, began to seem almost obscene amidst the constant revolutionary fervor. The most paranoid began to suspect that anyone who could successfully navigate revolutionary politics must have special skills. And where would those skills come from if not aristocratic training or secret connections? It was a perfect circular logic. Surviving proved you deserved to die. The final irony was that this logic applied even to the revolutionary leaders. One by one, they became suspected due to their own survival, until finally, the revolution literally devoured itself, executing almost everyone who had started it. Democracy isn't perfect either, but at least you keep your head. The most important lesson of the French Revolution is not that revolutions are inherently bad. Many of the fundamental ideas about human rights, equality, and democratic government that emerged from that period still form the basis of modern societies. The real lesson is about the dangers of political fanaticism and collective paranoia. When any political movement, no matter how noble its initial goals, creates an environment where survival depends on constant displays of ideological purity, the inevitable result is self-destruction. The French Revolution shows us what happens when the fear of not being revolutionary enough becomes more powerful than any specific revolutionary goal. The supreme irony is that you'd probably sympathize with many of the revolution's original objectives: social justice, equality, before the law, the end of hereditary privileges. But those sympathies wouldn't have saved you from the guillotine, because in the end, the French Revolution became less about achieving those goals and more about demonstrating that you wanted to achieve them more desperately than anyone else. So, the next time you complain about modern political polarization, remember, at least today, having the wrong political opinion doesn't result in public beheading. Although, come to think of it, maybe it's best not to give anyone ideas. History has a cruel sense of humor, and the French Revolution is its darkest joke, a movement that began by proclaiming the universal rights of man and ended by denying the most basic right of all, the right to continue having a head attached to your neck. Liberté, égalité, fraternity, and the guillotine for anyone who can't prove they deserve the first three.